Racist cop slaps black woman on a private jet. Flight stops mid-boarding. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. Alyssa Monroe stood at the edge of the private terminal where the air smelled faintly of jet fuel and polished marble, a place designed to feel quiet and exclusive even when tension lingered beneath the surface. And as she waited to board the sleek Gulfstream parked just beyond the glass, she appeared unremarkable to anyone passing by, dressed in a tailored blazer and flats, carrying a slim leather tote, calm, composed, and unassuming in a space where assumptions were made in seconds. Around her, boarding staff moved with rehearsed efficiency. Passengers exchanged polite nods, and a late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. Yet something about the moment felt brittle, like a calm that could fracture at any sound. Officer Daniel Wright, assigned to oversee security during boarding, scanned the area with an air of certainty that came from authority, his posture rigid, his tone clipped, his presence commanding attention without invitation. And when his gaze landed on Alyssa, it lingered longer than necessary, measuring, questioning, deciding. She met none of it with reaction, instead checking the time on her watch, mindful of a tight schedule measured not in minutes, but in outcomes, while a flight attendant nearby, Emily Carter, noticed the shift in the air, the subtle pause in movement, the way conversation softened as eyes turned. Words were exchanged that should have ended there, but they didn't, and the terminal seemed to hold its breath as the line stopped moving. The jet door open yet unreachable, boarding suspended without explanation. Alyssa remained steady, her expression unchanged, as if she understood something the room did not. While murmurs spread in low waves, passengers glancing at one another, phones discreetly lowered, unsure whether to look away or bear witness. The jet's polished fuselage reflected the scene back at itself, a mirror of power and privilege caught, mid-motion. And when the announcement came that boarding was paused, it carried no detail, only instruction, a rare interruption that rippled through the terminal like a warning bell. Captain James Holloway stood near the cockpit steps, receiving a message that tightened his jaw, his eyes lifting toward the terminal with concern sharpened by experience. While Alyssa finally shifted her weight, not in fear, not in anger, but with the patience of someone who knew time could work in her favor. To those watching, she was simply a black woman delayed at boarding, silent in the face of authority, yet the stillness around her was not surrender, but restraint, a deliberate choice that allowed the moment to reveal itself. The flight clock ticked, measured in minutes and miles, but the real distance being crossed was something else entirely. A line drawn between assumption and truth, and as the engines remained quiet and the door stayed open, it became clear that this journey would not begin until the room understood who truly belonged in control and why the pause mattered. A hush settled over the terminal as the pause stretched longer than anyone expected, and what had begun as a routine boarding moment slowly transformed into an uncomfortable stillness that made people aware of their own breathing, their own assumptions, their own unease. Alyssa Monroe remained exactly where she was, hands relaxed at her sides, gaze steady, neither challenging nor retreating, while the polished floors reflected the frozen scene like a quiet witness. Around her, passengers shifted their weight. A man adjusted his cufflinks. A woman glanced toward the windows, as if searching for an exit that did not exist, and somewhere in the background, the low hum of auxiliary power units underscored the silence with a mechanical patience that felt almost intentional. Officer Daniel Wright stood firm, his authority unquestioned in his own mind, convinced that the delay itself reinforced his control, while flight attendant Emily Carter felt a growing knot of concern that had nothing to do with schedules and everything to do with the way moments like this had a habit of spiraling. Alyssa's calm unsettled the space, not because it was defiant, but because it refused to give the room what it expected. No raised voice, no apology, no visible fear, just presence, measured and composed. The private terminal, designed to move people quickly and quietly, now felt exposed, its glass walls turning the waiting area into a display where every glance carried weight. Captain James Holloway, still near the aircraft stairs, listened carefully to a second message through his headset, his expression tightening as he looked back toward the terminal, aware that delays of this nature were rare and never insignificant. Time passed in small increments, seconds stretching into minutes, and with each passing moment, the sense of certainty shifted, not outwardly, but subtly, like a tide changing beneath calm water. Alyssa checked her watch again, not with urgency, but with acknowledgement, as if she were marking a moment rather than tracking a delay. And Emily noticed the detail, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be. Conversations began to falter entirely, replaced by glances that lingered too long, and the realization crept in that whatever had caused the pause was no longer a private exchange, but a shared experience, one that demanded attention whether anyone wanted to give it or not. Officer Wright spoke again, his tone clipped, procedural, convinced that formality alone could carry the moment. Yet the effect was the opposite, as several passengers instinctively leaned back, distancing themselves not from Alyssa, but from the authority they had once accepted without question. Alyssa did not respond immediately, not because she lacked words, but because she understood timing, the way silence could expose more than explanation ever could. The terminal doors remained open, the jet waiting, engines quiet, as if the aircraft itself had been instructed to observe rather than proceed. Emily took a small step forward, her training urging her to restore calm. But her instincts told her this was not something to smooth over, not something to rush past, because moments like this, once revealed, could not be undone. The pause had become a mirror, reflecting not just the people involved, but the system surrounding them. And as the minutes continued to pass, it grew increasingly clear that the flight was no longer delayed by logistics, but by a truth that had yet to speak its name. The longer the delay continued, the more the room began to reorganize itself around Alyssa Monroe, not physically, but emotionally, as if the space had quietly acknowledged her as the center of gravity. She did not raise her voice or gesture for attention, yet attention found her anyway, drawn by the unusual certainty in her posture, the way she stood as though she had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. Officer Daniel Wright remained close, his stance unchanged, but the confidence that once surrounded him now felt rehearsed, less solid than before, as if authority alone could no longer carry the weight of the moment. Emily Carter watched from a few steps away, noticing details she had learned to read over years of service. The subtle shift in how passengers positioned themselves, the way eyes followed Alyssa instead of the uniform, the quiet realization that something about this situation did not fit the familiar script. Alyssa finally spoke, her voice even, measured, and calm, addressing the space rather than any single person, asking only how long the delay was expected to last, not with complaint, but with professional curiosity. The question itself seemed to reset the atmosphere, because it did not sound like the voice of someone pleading for permission, but of someone accustomed to clarity and accountability. Officer Wright responded with formality, repeating procedure, reinforcing rules, yet his words echoed without the certainty they once carried, and the silence that followed fell heavier than any reply could have been. Captain James Holloway stepped closer to the terminal doors, his instincts telling him that the delay was no longer a minor inconvenience, but a decision point, one that would define how the rest of the day unfolded, not just for the flight, but for everyone watching. Alyssa turned slightly, her gaze moving across the waiting passengers, not accusatory, not defensive, but observant, as though she were taking in a room she would later remember in detail, the polished luggage, the tailored suits, the careful distance people kept from one another when discomfort entered the air. A phone vibrated somewhere, then another, and although no one openly recorded anything, the sense of being witnessed intensified, the awareness that moments like this had a way of traveling far beyond the walls that contained them. Emily took another step forward, her voice gentle as she offered water to nearby passengers, a small gesture meant to restore normalcy. But normalcy felt out of reach now, suspended alongside the halted boarding process. Alyssa declined with a polite nod, her focus returning to Officer Wright. Not with challenge, but with expectation, the kind that assumes answers will come because they must. The officer shifted, his weight, adjusting his belt, glancing briefly toward the jet, as though seeking reassurance from the symbols of authority surrounding him, yet finding none willing to speak on his behalf. The terminal clock ticked past another minute, its soft sound amplified by the quiet, marking time not as delay but as exposure. Alyssa checked her watch once more, then folded her hands calmly, signaling that she was prepared to wait as long as necessary, not because she lacked urgency, but because she understood leverage. Around them, passengers began to understand it too, that this pause was not accidental, that it carried meaning, and that whatever truth sat beneath the surface was slowly working its way forward. The jet remained still, the open door no longer an invitation, but a reminder that progress had conditions. And as the weight of the moment settled fully into place, it became clear that this was no longer about boarding a flight, but about who held the right to decide when things moved forward and why. The tension that had been quietly building now began to press outward, filling the terminal with an energy that no one could ignore, and Officer Daniel Wright sensed it even as he tried to maintain control, his voice growing firmer, more procedural, as though repeating policy might restore the authority he felt slipping. He asked Alyssa Monroe for clarification again, not because he needed it, but because the act of asking reinforced a hierarchy he believed was unquestionable. Yet Alyssa did not respond immediately, her pause deliberate, her composure unchanged, her attention focused not on the uniform before her, but on the broader space that had gathered around them. Passengers listened closely now, no longer pretending to be uninvolved, and Emily Carter noticed how the room had shifted from passive observation to quiet alignment, people no longer wondering what Alyssa had done wrong, but instead questioning why the situation felt so mismanaged. Alyssa finally answered, her tone calm and professional, stating that she had complied with every request and was simply waiting for the boarding process to resume, a statement so measured it left little room for contradiction. Officer Wright replied with increasing insistence, citing authority and responsibility. Yet each word seemed to echo back thinner than before, stripped of the unquestioned weight it once carried. Captain James Holloway stepped fully into the terminal now, his presence drawing attention, not because he raised his voice, but because his role demanded resolution, and he could sense that the delay was no longer about logistics, but accountability. Alyssa turned slightly toward him, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement, a gesture subtle enough to go unnoticed by most, yet clear to those trained to recognize professional respect. The air felt heavier as more staff gathered discreetly at the edges, whispers traveling just far enough to confirm that calls had been made, that questions were being asked beyond the terminal walls. Officer Wright glanced toward Captain Holloway, then back at Alyssa, as if recalculating the balance of power in real time, realizing that the room was no longer his alone to command. Alyssa remained steady, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, conveying neither triumph nor fear, only patience, the kind that unsettles systems built on urgency and compliance. Emily Carter watched closely, understanding that moments like this were rare, not because conflict was unusual, but because restraint was, and Alyssa's restraint was forcing everyone else to confront their own reactions. The terminal clock advanced another minute, its steady rhythm underscoring the sense that time itself was now a participant, documenting every second of uncertainty. Passengers exchanged looks, some nodding subtly, others folding their arms, a collective awareness forming that this pause mattered, that it would be remembered long after the flight reached its destination. Captain Holloway spoke quietly to a staff member, his expression serious, his eyes returning repeatedly to Alyssa, not with suspicion, but with consideration, as if he were beginning to understand that she was not waiting for permission, but for acknowledgement. Officer Wright shifted again, his confidence no longer absolute, The certainty in his stance replaced by calculation, and in that subtle change, the dynamic fully tipped. The terminal, once a place of swift passage, had become a space of reckoning, and as the weight of unspoken truths settled into the silence, it was clear that whatever came next would redefine not only the flight, but the roles everyone believed they held within it. What no one in the terminal could see was that the stillness surrounding Alyssa Monroe was not accidental but practiced, shaped by years of moving through spaces where power revealed itself most clearly when it believed it was unquestioned. She stood quietly as Captain James Holloway spoke in low tones with staff, her attention divided between the room and the subtle signals that told her the moment was ripening, the slight delay between messages, the careful way people chose their words, the way authority began to ask instead of command. Alyssa adjusted the strap of her tote, not out of nervousness, but habit, her fingers brushing against the familiar weight of documents and devices that never left her side, tools that did not announce themselves, yet carried consequences far beyond this terminal. Officer Daniel Wright watched her closely, searching for something that would justify his certainty, a misplaced reaction, a crack in composure. But Alyssa gave him nothing, her calm creating a contrast that made his impatience increasingly visible to those around them. Emily Carter noticed the detail that shifted everything for her, the way Alyssa's eyes tracked conversations without appearing to listen, the way she seemed less concerned with the delay than with the responses it provoked, as though the pause itself was the purpose. A staff member approached Captain Holloway again, whispering just long enough to change his expression, and when he nodded, it was with the weight of someone receiving confirmation rather than instruction. Alyssa glanced at her watch once more, then lowered her hand slowly, her gaze steady, signaling not frustration but readiness, as if she had been waiting for this precise alignment of circumstances. Passengers felt it too, the sense that something unseen was unfolding beneath the polished surface of the terminal, a process that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, only time and attention. Officer Wright cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control by restating expectations, but his words landed without momentum, absorbed by a room that had begun to listen differently. Alyssa responded with a brief acknowledgement, her voice level, her words precise, thanking him for his patience, a phrase that subtly inverted the dynamic, shifting the burden of composure back onto him. The effect was immediate, though understated, as several passengers exchanged glances, recognizing the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to accountability rather than intimidation. Captain Holloway stepped closer now, positioning himself within the circle of attention, his presence signaling that the situation had escalated beyond routine protocol. And when he addressed Alyssa directly, it was with professional courtesy, asking only whether she was comfortable continuing to wait. Alyssa met his eyes and nodded once, affirming without explanation, her calm communicating that discomfort was not her concern, resolution was. Emily Carter felt a tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition, understanding that moments like this did not end with apologies or delays, but with clarity, often uncomfortable, always revealing. The terminal clock marked another minute, and with it, the final pieces seemed to fall into place, calls completed, confirmations received, decisions forming beyond the glass walls. Alyssa shifted her stance slightly, grounding herself, not preparing to move, but to stand firm, and in that subtle adjustment, the room sensed that the waiting was nearly over. Whatever truth had been planted beneath the surface was about to emerge, not with spectacle, but with the quiet authority of facts. And as the jet remained still and the terminal held its breath, it became clear that this pause was no longer about a flight schedule, but about what happens when composure outlasts assumption and patience exposes power. What no one in the terminal could see was that the stillness surrounding Alyssa Monroe was not accidental but practiced, shaped by years of moving through spaces where power revealed itself most clearly when it believed it was unquestioned. She stood quietly as Captain James Holloway spoke in low tones with staff, her attention divided between the room and the subtle signals that told her the moment was ripening. The slight delay between messages, the careful way people chose their words, the way authority began to ask instead of command. Alyssa adjusted the strap of her tote, not out of nervousness, but habit, her fingers brushing against the familiar weight of documents and devices that never left her side, tools that did not announce themselves, yet carried consequences far beyond this terminal. Officer Daniel Wright watched her closely, searching for something that would justify his certainty, a misplaced reaction, a crack in composure. But Alyssa gave him nothing, her calm creating a contrast that made his impatience increasingly visible to those around them. Emily Carter noticed the detail that shifted everything for her, the way Alyssa's eyes tracked conversations without appearing to listen, the way she seemed less concerned with the delay than with the responses it provoked, as though the pause itself was the purpose. A staff member approached Captain Holloway again, whispering just long enough to change his expression, and when he nodded, it was with the weight of someone receiving confirmation rather than instruction. Alyssa glanced at her watch once more, then lowered her hand slowly, her gaze steady, signaling not frustration but readiness, as if she had been waiting for this precise alignment of circumstances. Passengers felt it too, the sense that something unseen was unfolding beneath the polished surface of the terminal, a process that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, only time and attention. Officer Wright cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control by restating expectations, but his words landed without momentum, absorbed by a room that had begun to listen differently. Alyssa responded with a brief acknowledgement, her voice level, her words precise, thanking him for his patience, a phrase that subtly inverted the dynamic, shifting the burden of composure back onto him. The effect was immediate, though understated, as several passengers exchanged glances, recognizing the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to accountability rather than intimidation. Captain Holloway stepped closer now, positioning himself within the circle of attention, his presence signaling that the situation had escalated beyond routine protocol. And when he addressed Alyssa directly, it was with professional courtesy, asking only whether she was comfortable continuing to wait. Alyssa met his eyes and nodded once, affirming without explanation, her calm communicating that discomfort was not her concern, resolution was. Emily Carter felt a tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition, understanding that moments like this did not end with apologies or delays, but with clarity, often uncomfortable, always revealing. The terminal clock marked another minute, and with it, the final pieces seemed to fall into place, calls completed, confirmations received, decisions forming beyond the glass walls. Alyssa shifted her stance slightly, grounding herself, not preparing to move, but to stand firm, and in that subtle adjustment, the room sensed that the waiting was nearly over. Whatever truth had been planted beneath the surface was about to emerge, not with spectacle, but with the quiet authority of facts. And as the jet remained still and the terminal held its breath, it became clear that this pause was no longer about a flight schedule, but about what happens when composure outlasts assumption and patience exposes power. The shift happened quietly, without announcement, but everyone felt it when Captain James Holloway's phone vibrated again, and this time he did not step aside to listen, instead straightening where he stood as if the message had anchored him in place. His expression changed in a way seasoned travelers recognized immediately. Not confusion, not irritation, but clarity, the kind that settles when uncertainty ends and responsibility takes over. He looked from a screen to Alyssa Monroe, then back again, confirming what the moment had been building toward. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but unmistakably firm, informing the terminal that boarding would remain paused until further notice. The effect was immediate, a collective intake of breath, because pauses usually came with explanations, and this one came with none. Officer Daniel Wright reacted first, his posture stiffening as he questioned the necessity, his tone sharper than before, but Captain Holloway did not engage in debate, responding only that instructions had been received and would be followed. Alyssa remained still, her composure unchanged. Yet something in the room subtly reoriented toward her, as though the invisible center of authority had shifted without ceremony. Emily Carter felt it clearly now, the confirmation of what she had suspected, that Alyssa was not waiting for permission, but for acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement was beginning to take shape. Captain Holloway addressed Alyssa directly, his words measured and respectful, asking her to confirm her availability, not her compliance, a distinction that did not go unnoticed by those listening. Alyssa nodded once and answered evenly, confirming without elaboration, her voice steady, her demeanor professional, and in that exchange, the balance tipped fully, the room recognizing a hierarchy it had not seen at first. Officer Wright's certainty faltered visibly, his questions trailing off as he realized that whatever authority he believed he held here was no longer decisive, and the realization unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. Passengers watched closely now, understanding that they were witnessing something rare, a reversal not fueled by confrontation, but by structure, a system asserting itself through quiet precision. Captain Holloway received another message, this one prompting him to instruct staff to secure the terminal temporarily, not as a punishment, but as a protocol, and the language mattered, because it framed the moment as procedural rather than personal. Alyssa shifted her stance slightly, grounding herself, and for the first time since the delay began, she reached into her tote, retrieving a slim credential holder without display or flourish, offering it only to Captain Holloway, who glanced at it briefly before closing it with visible recognition. He did not announce what he had seen, did not explain it to the room, but his posture changed in a way that said everything, his shoulders squaring, his attention sharpening, his role clarified. Emily Carter noticed the subtle reactions ripple outward, the way conversations ceased entirely, the way even Officer Wright seemed to shrink back into formality, his voice now careful, measured, stripped of assumption. Alyssa did not look around for validation, did not seek reaction, because this moment was not about exposure, it was about alignment, the system recognizing one of its own and adjusting accordingly. Captain Holloway spoke again, his voice steady as he informed the terminal that all procedures would continue under revised oversight, and that boarding would resume only when appropriate clearances were confirmed. No one argued this time, because the authority behind the words was no longer performative, it was structural. The jet remained still, engines quiet, but the atmosphere had changed completely, the pause no longer tense but resolved, and as Alyssa returned the credential to her tote and folded her hands calmly, it became clear to everyone present that the waiting had reached its purpose. The truth had entered the room without spectacle, and the direction of power had shifted permanently, not with force, but with certainty. With the authority in the room now clearly redefined, the terminal began to move again, not hurriedly, but deliberately, as procedures adjusted to reflect the reality that had just been acknowledged. Captain James Holloway coordinated quietly with staff, his instructions precise, ensuring that oversight was documented, communications logged, and decisions traced through proper channels, not to escalate the situation, but to resolve it correctly. Officer Daniel Wright stood off to the side, his earlier confidence replaced by a rigid attentiveness, responding when addressed, no longer directing the flow, his role reduced to observation as the system he relied upon recalibrated without him. Alyssa Monroe remained composed, her presence steady, her attention focused on the process rather than the people, understanding that accountability was most effective when it unfolded without spectacle. Emily Carter assisted passengers with calm reassurance, explaining that boarding would resume shortly, her tone confident now that clarity had replaced confusion, and the murmurs in the terminal softened into subdued conversations marked by reflection rather than impatience. The pause, once heavy with tension, now carried a different weight, the unmistakable feeling of consequences aligning with actions, not through punishment, but through process. Captain Holloway received confirmation from operations, nodding once as he acknowledged revised parameters, his gaze briefly meeting Alyssa's in professional understanding, the recognition that the moment had passed its threshold and entered resolution. Alyssa inclined her head slightly, accepting the acknowledgement without comment, because for her, the outcome was not about recognition, but about correction. Officer Wright was informed quietly that his involvement would be reviewed, not as an accusation, but as a standard follow-up, language carefully chosen to reflect procedure rather than judgment, and the effect was immediate, his posture tightening as the reality settled that authority was never absolute, only conditional. Passengers observed this shift closely, some exchanging glances, others lowering their eyes, all aware that they had witnessed a lesson rarely taught so clearly, that systems function best when they are accountable, not unquestioned. The terminal clock continued its steady rhythm, now marking progress instead of delay, and staff began preparing the jet for boarding once more. The open door, no longer symbolic of suspension, but of continuity restored under proper oversight. Alyssa checked her watch again, this time with a small nod of satisfaction, not because time had been regained, but because alignment had been achieved. Emily Carter noticed the subtle relief among passengers, the way shoulders relaxed, the way voices steadied, as if the space itself had exhaled after holding tension for far too long. Captain Holloway announced that boarding would resume shortly, his voice calm, confident, and unchallenged, and no one questioned the decision this time, because the authority behind it was transparent and earned. Alyssa gathered her tote, positioning herself to move when directed, not to assert priority, but to demonstrate cooperation within a system that now recognized her role. Officer Wright remained silent, his earlier assumptions replaced by a careful awareness that moments like this left records, impressions, and lessons that extended far beyond the terminal. As boarding preparations concluded and the pathway to the jet cleared, it was evident that the outcome required no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only the steady application of truth within a structure designed to respond when properly engaged. The terminal returned to motion, but it did not return to normal, because everyone present carried forward an understanding that authority, when challenged by composure and preparation, did not need to be confronted to be corrected. It only needed to be observed long enough to reveal itself. Boarding resumed with a calm that felt earned rather than forced. And as passengers moved toward the jet in an orderly flow, the terminal seemed to carry a quieter understanding than before, one shaped by what had unfolded without spectacle. Alyssa Monroe stepped forward when directed, neither first nor last, her pace unhurried, her posture composed, acknowledging the crew with a polite nod as she crossed the threshold from terminal to aircraft. Captain James Holloway stood near the door, greeting passengers with steady professionalism, and when Alyssa reached him, their brief exchange carried mutual respect, an understanding that required no explanation. Emily Carter assisted nearby, her voice warm and reassuring, the practiced cadence of service now grounded in clarity, and she watched as shoulders relaxed and conversations resumed with a softer tone. Officer Daniel Wright remained behind, his role concluded for the moment, his presence subdued, observing as the process continued without him at its center, a quiet reminder that authority does not persist when it loses alignment with accountability. Inside the cabin, the jet felt serene, leather seats immaculate, overhead lights set to a gentle glow, and Alyssa took her seat with a measured ease, placing her tote beneath the seat in front of her, fastening her belt, and settling without ceremony. Passengers nearby exchanged small courtesies, nods and brief smiles, the kind that surface when tension has passed and reflection takes its place. The cabin door closed smoothly, sealing the transition from pause to progress, and, as the engines prepared, the low hum signaled not urgency, but readiness. Captain Holloway's voice came over the intercom, steady and composed, thanking everyone for their patience and confirming departure, his words precise, his tone confident, and this time there was no question of authority, only trust. Alyssa looked out the window as the aircraft began to move, the terminal slowly receding, the polished glass and stillness giving way to motion, and she allowed herself a quiet moment of acknowledgement, not triumph, but resolution. What had occurred did not require validation from a room, because its impact extended beyond it, carried forward through documentation, oversight, and the systems designed to respond when engaged correctly. Emily moved through the cabin, attending to passengers, her demeanor relaxed now. And as she passed Alyssa, their eyes met briefly in mutual recognition, a shared understanding that calm had prevailed because it had been protected. The jet turned onto the runway, aligning itself for departure, and as speed increased, the sense of suspension lifted fully, replaced by forward momentum. Alyssa reflected not on the delay, but on the lesson it carried, that composure could hold space long enough for truth to surface, that preparation did not need an audience to be effective, and that dignity, once maintained, often guided outcomes more reliably than force. As the aircraft lifted, the city shrinking below, the moment settled into memory for those who witnessed it, a quiet recalibration of assumptions and roles. The flight continued smoothly, conversations resuming, schedules adjusting. Yet beneath the routine, an imprint remained, a recognition that authority is not defined by volume or posture, but by alignment with principles that endure scrutiny. Alyssa closed her eyes briefly, centering herself for the work ahead, knowing that what mattered most had already been accomplished, not the destination of the flight, but the correction of a moment that could have gone unnoticed if not for patience. As the jet climbed steadily, leaving the terminal behind, the lesson traveled with it, a reminder that when power pauses long enough to be observed, justice often arrives quietly, already seated, ready to move forward when the path is clear.